In 1870, the city of Newark, New Jersey, manufactured 90% of all the leather in the United States. 90%. One city, population barely over 100,000, tanning and finishing and shipping nearly every hide that became a shoe, a saddle, a belt, a carriage seat in the entire country. That industry alone brought in $8.5 million that year, and the man most responsible for it, a tinkerer from Massachusetts named Seth Boyden, never bothered to patent what he'd invented. He just gave his process away. That detail tells you something about Newark that most people never learn, which is that for about 200 years it was one of the most productive, ambitious, and wealthy cities in America, and that the people who built it were often more interested in the building than in the credit. Newark isn't a story about a place that was always struggling. It's a story about a place that was, for a very long time, winning, and then, through a slow accumulation of decisions and migrations and economic shifts, found itself emptied of the very things that had made it extraordinary. The founding is older than most people expect. Newark was settled in May of 1666 by a band of Connecticut Puritans led by a man named Robert Treat. These weren't adventurers looking for opportunity. They were religious conservatives fleeing tolerance. The New Haven colony had merged with the more permissive Connecticut colony, and Treat's congregation, which had established a theocracy in Milford, wanted no part of a government that permitted Quakers. So they crossed into the newly English province of New Jersey, negotiated with the Hackensack Indians, and bought the land along the Passaic River. The price came to roughly $700 worth of goods: gunpowder, lead bars, axes, coats, guns, pistols, swords. The deed wasn't signed until July of 1667, and the name itself was a matter of some dispute. Treat wanted to call the settlement Milford, after the town they'd left, but the Reverend Abraham Pearson, who had been a preacher in Newark-on-Trent, England, won the argument, possibly by suggesting the name also meant New Ark, as in the Ark of the Covenant. Either way, it stuck. For its first century and a half, Newark was a farming community with a sideline in cider, beer, and hides. It wasn't until after the Revolution that it began to become something else. The population in 1776 was around 1,000 people, which is less than a single housing project today. George Washington camped his Continental Army at Military Park on Broad Street for a week that November, quartering at the Eagle Tavern, and then moved on. The town was a footnote, a place to pass through on the way to somewhere that mattered. What changed everything was one man's obsessive curiosity. Seth Boyden arrived in Newark in 1815 at the age of 27. He had already invented machines for making nails and splitting leather hides, but what he did in Newark made the city. In 1819, he got hold of a piece of German military leather, a cap front, high gloss, nothing like what American tanners produced. He set up a shed and reverse engineered the lacquering process, then opened the first patent leather factory in the United States. Within 2 decades, Newark had over 150 patent leather manufacturers. By 1860, the city produced nearly all the patent leather in the country. But Boyden, in the way of people who think faster than they can profit, had already moved on. In 1826, he cracked the secret of malleable cast iron, a European monopoly that American industry had been unable to replicate. He spent 6 years on it. Once he succeeded, he sold the leather business and opened a foundry. Thomas Edison, who knew something about invention, later called Boyden one of America's greatest inventors and said his work gave employment to millions of people. Boyden himself died nearly penniless in 1870, having never cared much for patents. His statue stands today in Washington Park on Broad Street, and if you've walked past it, you've probably walked past it. What Boyden started, the canals and railroads amplified. The Morris Canal opened in 1831, connecting Newark to the iron country and farmland of northwestern New Jersey. 3 years later, in 1834, the New Jersey Railroad arrived, and Newark was designated a federal port of entry. The city incorporated in 1836 with a population of about 11,000. The ingredients were all in place: raw materials coming in cheaply, finished goods going out efficiently, and a workforce that was growing fast. By 1850, the population had more than tripled to nearly 39,000. By 1860, Newark was the 11th largest city in the United States and the largest industrial city in the country. Now the leather was only the foundation. What rose on top of it was an astonishing variety, and some of it changed the world in ways that had nothing to do with hides and tanning. In 1872, John Wesley Hyatt and his brother Isaiah moved their celluloid manufacturing company to Newark. Celluloid, the first artificial plastic, was already Hyatt's invention, but Newark gave him the infrastructure and labor force to scale production. Combs, buttons, billiard balls, dental plates, eyeglass frames, piano keys, anything that had been carved from ivory or tortoiseshell or bone could now be molded from celluloid, and Newark became the capital of this entirely new material. Then a chemist working for Hyatt discovered that celluloid dissolved in amyl acetate could be spread into a thin, stable, flexible film. The company didn't pursue this application, but in 1887, a Newark Episcopal minister named Hannibal Goodwin, looking for a way to project images for his Sunday school classes at the Plume House on Broad Street, filed a patent for photographic film made from celluloid. He spent over a decade fighting George Eastman in court over the patent, and Goodwin died in 1900 before the case was fully resolved, killed after a street accident near a construction site. But his estate eventually won a settlement from Eastman Kodak. Newark named a street after him. The motion picture industry, in a real sense, traces one of its roots to a minister's rectory on Broad Street. Around the same time, Edward Weston set up shop in Newark and invented a series of precision electrical measuring instruments that became the standard for the field. The city wasn't just manufacturing goods, it was generating ideas, and the ideas were worth more than the goods. Jewelry manufacturers set up shop and turned Newark into one of the premier jewelry-making cities in the world. George Crements founded his operation in 1866, and at one point manufactured 99% of all collar buttons sold in America. When the collar button went out of fashion in the 1920s, he'd already pivoted to other jewelry. The Tiffany factory operated out of the North Ward for decades, producing luxury pieces until it closed in 1984. Hat makers, trunk hardware makers, carriage builders, saddlers, every industry that touched leather or metal seemed to find a home in Newark, and each one spawned suppliers and competitors who clustered in the same neighborhoods because proximity meant efficiency. The insurance industry arrived in the middle of the 19th century and would prove to be even more durable than the factories. Mutual Benefit Life was founded in 1845. Then, in 1873, came Prudential. Its founder, John Fairfield Dryden, was another transplanted New Englander. The pattern is impossible to miss, and he built the company by selling small industrial life policies to working-class families, a market that the established Hartford firms had ignored. The Prudential wasn't glamorous at the start. Dryden's agents went door to door in the neighborhoods collecting weekly premiums of nickels and dimes. But the math worked. By the late 1880s, Newark companies sold more insurance than those of any city in America except Hartford. Prudential grew into a colossus. In 1892, the company hired architect George B. Post to design its headquarters on Broad Street, a series of gray Indiana limestone buildings in the Romanesque style, the tallest structures in the city at the turn of the century. Those buildings lasted until 1956, when Prudential demolished them to build the modernist plaza that stands there now. Remember that date, 1956. It will matter later. What's easy to forget about cities at their peak is that the wealth was physical. You could see it, and it was designed to be seen. The beer barons built mansions on High Street that were monuments to competitive vanity. Peter Ballantyne, a Scottish immigrant, founded his brewery in 1840. By 1879, P. Ballantyne & Sons was the sixth largest brewery in the country. His son, John Home Ballantyne, built a 27-room brick and limestone mansion in 1885 at 43 Washington Street, a house now preserved as a wing of the Newark Museum. 3 years later, a few blocks away, beer baron Gottfried Kruger, who had arrived in America poor and become one of the country's most successful brewers, built his own mansion on High Street, specifically designed to outshine the Ballantyne house. The Germans of High Street wanted everyone to know they had arrived, and limestone was how you said it. The breweries themselves were enormous. At its peak, Newark had more than 35 of them, drawn by the city's crystal-clear water supply. Ballantyne, Kruger, Christian Feigenspan, whose Pride of Newark brand won a silver medal at the Paris exhibition of 1891, and dozens of others poured rivers of lager and ale out of the city's industrial wards. Kruger's Brewery made history of a different kind in 1933 when it produced the first beer ever sold in a can. That happened in Newark, though Richmond, Virginia got the test market. The city kept building upward and outward. In 1895, Branch Brook Park opened, designed in part by the Olmsted firm, the same practice that had created Central Park in Manhattan. Branch Brook became the first county park in the United States, and its cherry trees, which would eventually number over 5,000, remain the largest collection of ornamental cherry blossoms in the nation, surpassing even Washington, D.C. That is not a misprint. More cherry trees in Newark than in the capital. Down on Broad Street, the commercial life of the city was becoming something truly spectacular. The intersection of Broad and Market, known simply as Four Corners, was, according to various accounts, among the busiest intersections in the entire country. Department stores anchored the district. Hahn & Company opened a new building at the corner of Broad and New Streets in 1901, designed by Goldwyn Sterrett, a protege of Daniel Burnham. It was the carriage trade store where Newark's wealthiest families shopped. When the doors opened, 1,200 employees were needed to run the place, many of them women, a new career option in an era when, as one magazine noted, women's employment choices had recently been limited to teaching and the needle. Louis Bamberger came at the market from a different angle. He'd taken over a bankrupt dry goods shop in 1892, and together with his brother-in-law Felix Fuld, built it into a retail empire. By 1912, when the new Bamberger's flagship opened at Market and Washington Streets, designed by Jarvis Hunt, it was one of the largest department stores in the country, eventually the sixth largest, covering an entire city block, with 1.2 million square feet, more than 200 departments spread across 9 floors and 2 basements, its own library branch, its own post office, a restaurant on the 10th floor, and a soda fountain equipped to serve 1 million drinks a year. A fleet of 114 delivery trucks, first horse-drawn, later motorized, fanned out across the region every day, moving 15,000 packages and 25,000 at Christmas. Bamberger's even had its own dedicated telephone exchange. The number 565 was solely theirs, with direct dial numbers for most of New Jersey's suburbs. 15,000 telephone calls a day came in, handled by 15 operators. If you were alive in northern New Jersey in the first half of the 20th century, you knew Bamberger's the way you knew your own address. The store was a world unto itself. The Temple of Music on the 6th floor sold pianos and Victrolas in rooms with double partitions and lead glass ceilings for sound privacy. A crybaby room was provided for unhappy children, sheltering serious customers from the noise. The men's department occupied 2 full floors. The Ivy Room served lunch and afternoon tea within cream-colored, ivy-covered walls. In the basement, 42-ton refrigerator machines ran with a daily capacity of 65 tons, and 80 miles of wiring stretched through the building. Raymond Loewy and Associates designed many of the floors, bringing an architectural elegance that made Bamberger's feel less like a store and more like a public institution, which in Newark it was. The Bambergers and the Fulds were also staggeringly generous philanthropists. They gave $650,000 to build the Newark Museum's original building. They donated the cherry trees that fill Branch Brook Park. They funded Beth Israel Hospital, the YMHA, the New Jersey Historical Society, and perhaps most remarkably, they provided the founding endowment for the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, the institution that would later bring Albert Einstein to New Jersey. The money for one of the most important intellectual centers in the world came from a department store in Newark. Picture what it was like. In the 1940s, before anything had really changed, a trip downtown was a weekly ritual for families across northern New Jersey. You came by bus or trolley or train. The trolley lines radiated out from 4 corners like spokes, and you stepped out onto sidewalks packed with people. Bamberger's was the southern anchor. Walking north along Broad Street, you'd pass S. Klein, the self-service pioneer, where iron racks held high fashion at prices the average family could afford, its 4-story S sign visible for blocks. You'd pass Kresge's, which occupied the old Ploutz Beehive location and ran a toy department where, at Christmas in 1958, a model monorail circled the ceiling. Then you'd reach Haynes at the north end, the elegant one, where the saleswomen still knew their customers by name. In between were Griffith's piano showrooms, hat shops, jewelers, shoe stores, restaurants, over 100 restaurants in the downtown core. Schraff's on Broad and West Park was the social hub for women shopping, its walnut woodwork and American period furniture offering a genteel dining room in an era when many restaurants were still oriented toward men. You could spend an entire day downtown and never run out of things to see, buy, eat, or watch. There was simply no other place like it in New Jersey, and there were only a handful of places like it in the country. And here's a detail that deserves a pause. In February of 1922, Louis Bamberger, a man whose genius was in selling things, launched a radio station from the 6th floor of his Newark store. The idea was straightforward. If you operate a radio station, you sell more radios. The station broadcast its first program on February 22, 1922, a recording of Al Jolson singing April Showers on a 500-watt signal. The call letters assigned were WOR, recycled from the decommissioned USS California. Within a year, WOR was so popular that Bamberger briefly considered shutting it down because it was hurting phonograph sales. He didn't, of course. WOR became a founding station of the Mutual Broadcasting System and one of the most important radio outlets in New York. But its origin was a department store in Newark. By 1941, the station had changed its city of license to New York, which is a small migration that foreshadows a much larger one. Meanwhile, the physical city kept reaching higher. Proctor's Palace Theater opened on Thanksgiving Day, 1915, a 10-story double-decker theater designed by John W. Merrow and built for $1 million. The ground-level auditorium seated 2,800. The rooftop theater above it held another 1,400. It was one of the rare double-decker theaters in the country, its narrow facade squeezed onto a lot near the fourth busiest corner in the world. Vaudeville acts ran from morning until late at night in what Frederick Proctor called continuous vaudeville. The Adams Theater opened in 1912 as the Schubert, a Beaux-Arts palace with 2,000 seats, hosting Broadway tryouts and later booking Duke Ellington, Ella Fitzgerald, the Marx Brothers, Tommy Dorsey, and Cab Calloway. The Paramount, Loew's State, the Branford. By the 1920s, Newark had more than a dozen major theaters, any one of which could seat over 1,000 people, most of them ornate in ways that would be financially unthinkable today. The Robert Treat Hotel opened in 1916, timed to coincide with the city's 250th anniversary celebration. It was designed by the Newark firm of Gilbert and Beitel, a 14-story Renaissance Revival tower at 50 Park Place, directly across from Military Park, built on land owned by the Fidelity Trust Company and constructed by the George A. Fuller Company. The first 4 stories are rusticated cast stone, with 2-story arches forming the entrance arcade, the arches topped by figurehead keystones. Above, 6 bays of plain Flemish bond brick rise cleanly to a mammoth copper entablature, with a richly decorated frieze and wrought iron balconies at the top. The first guests were President Woodrow Wilson and his wife Edith, who came to attend the Newark Board of Trade dinner. The 5th-floor suite they occupied became the Presidential Suite, and over the following decades, it would host Franklin Roosevelt, Albert Einstein, who attended a dinner in his honor there in 1933, John F. Kennedy, and Martin Luther King, Jr. The hotel was financed by Uzal McCarter, a former state attorney general and founder of Public Service Corporation of New Jersey, the precursor to PSE&G. McCarter understood something about civic investment. The hotel wasn't just a business. It was a statement that Newark was a city worth staying in. In 1930, 2 Art Deco skyscrapers rose almost simultaneously, transforming the skyline. The Left Court Newark building, later known as 1180 for its address at 1180 Raymond Boulevard, was designed by Frank Grad and Sons. It stood 35 stories and 449 feet, briefly making it the tallest building in Newark. The following year, the National Newark Building surpassed it at 465 feet and 34 floors, designed by John H. and Wilson C. Ely, its crown modeled after the mausoleum at Halicarnassus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The mezzanine held 10 murals by J. Monroe Hewlett and Charles Gulbranson depicting the growth of commerce in Newark. Together, the 2 towers were known as the Art Deco Twins, and they remained the tallest buildings in all of New Jersey for nearly 60 years until a tower went up in Jersey City in 1989. The city's connections to the world beyond its borders kept multiplying. In 1911, the Hudson and Manhattan Railroad was completed, linking Newark directly to Manhattan by tunnel under the Hudson River. The line, now known as PATH, meant that a Newark commuter could reach Lower Manhattan in about 20 minutes. Port Newark opened in 1915 and grew steadily. The city had its own commercial airport, Newark Metropolitan Airport, which opened in 1928 as the first major commercial airport in the metropolitan area. By the time the Art Deco twins were rising over Broad Street, Newark was connected to everywhere, by rail, by road, by water, by air. It was not a suburb of New York. It was a peer city with its own economy, its own cultural institutions, its own identity. The 1920 census recorded 414,524 residents. The 1930 census would push that number to its peak. Then came Penn Station. Dedicated on March 23, 1935, Newark's Pennsylvania Station was one of the last major commissions of McKim, Mead, and White, the same firm that had designed the original Penn Station in Manhattan, the one whose demolition in 1963 still makes architects wince. But where the New York station had been all Roman grandeur and Beaux-Arts columns, Newark's version embraced the modern. The Art Deco details are everywhere. Stainless steel entrances with ornate metalwork, 800-pound chandeliers ringed with the signs of the zodiac, walls wainscoted in Montana rose-yellow travertine, used there for the first time on the East Coast. The main waiting room runs 175 feet long and 51 feet high. Carved stone medallions tell the story of transportation from ox carts to locomotives. The Pennsylvania Railroad had acquired 600 rival lines by the time it built this station, making it the largest corporation in the world. It could afford confidence, and the station radiates it. The population peaked in 1930 at 442,337, and that number is where the story begins to turn, though at the time nobody would have felt it turning. Newark in the 1930s was a city of churches. It was called the City of Churches, and also a city of music. Sarah Vaughan was born there in 1924, the daughter of a carpenter and a laundress who both sang in the choir at Mount Zion Baptist Church. She won an amateur contest at the Apollo Theater in Harlem in 1942 and became one of the greatest jazz vocalists who ever lived, but she grew up singing in Newark, and the city's musical infrastructure, the churches, the theater circuit, the nightclubs on Springfield Avenue, was the incubator. Connie Francis grew up in Newark. Dionne Warwick was born there. So was the writer Philip Roth, who set novel after novel in the city of his childhood, writing about the Jewish neighborhoods of Wequahic with an attention to physical detail that amounts to a kind of architectural preservation. If you want to know what a Newark street felt like in the 1940s, the stoops, the candy stores, the playground at Chancellor Avenue School, Roth is as close as you'll get to walking through it. The Depression hit, as it hit everywhere, but Newark's industrial base was broad enough to absorb the blow. Prohibition had already closed the breweries, temporarily it seemed, and the crash slowed construction. But the city still had its department stores, its theaters, its factories, its insurance companies, its railroad stations, its port. The demands of World War II brought a second wind. The factories retooled and ran at full capacity. Newark felt briefly like itself again. But underneath the wartime recovery, something structural had changed. The Federal Housing Administration, created in 1934, began guaranteeing low-cost mortgages for veterans returning from the war. That sounds like good policy, and for millions of Americans it was. But the FHA redlined nearly all of Newark, which meant that the mortgages it guaranteed were for houses in the suburbs, not in the city. White veterans and their families could buy homes in the new developments spreading across Essex, Morris, and Union counties. They could not, as a practical matter, get the same financing for homes in Newark. The city that had been gaining population for 3 centuries began to empty. Between 1950 and 1967, Newark's white population dropped from 363,000 to 158,000. In the same period, the black population grew from 70,000 to 220,000, as families arriving from the rural South during the Great Migration settled into neighborhoods that were increasingly crowded and underserved. The demographic math was straightforward. The people with the most economic mobility left. taking their tax revenue and their consumer spending, and the people who arrived had the least. The city's tax base contracted while its needs expanded. It is the oldest story in post-war American urbanism, and Newark lived it as acutely as any city in the country. The department stores felt it first, or at least they acted on it first. In 1957, Bamberger's opened its first major suburban branch at Garden State Plaza in Paramus. It was an overnight sensation. By the mid-1960s, the company had a dozen locations scattered across New Jersey. The Newark flagship was still open, but its role was diminishing. The shoppers who had once ridden the trolley to Market Street were now driving to parking lots in Bergen County. Hans held on longer, partly because its clientele had always been the carriage trade, and partly because inertia is a powerful force in retail. But the energy was draining out of Broad Street. Store by store, the ladies' mile thinned. Kresge's, Gurkha's, S. Klein. Each one closed or contracted according to its own calendar, but the trajectory was the same. The theaters went dark one by one. Proctor's Palace, that $1 million double-decker on Market Street, closed in 1968. It stands today, a shoe store occupying its renovated lobby, the upper 7 floors abandoned since the door shut. The Adams Theater closed around the same time. The Paramount survived a while longer, but eventually went the same way. If you walk downtown Newark today and look up, which most people don't, you can see the ornamental facades of buildings that have been empty above the ground floor for half a century. In July of 1967, the tensions that had been building for 2 decades erupted. A cab driver named John Smith was pulled over and beaten during arrest. A crowd gathered at the police precinct. 6 days of violence followed, leaving 26 dead, over 1,000 wounded, and $10 million in property damage. Springfield Avenue, the commercial heart of the black community, was gutted. But the riots didn't cause Newark's decline. They accelerated what was already in motion. The white population, already shrinking, shrank faster. The middle-class black population that had the means to leave began leaving too. By 1980, the city was down to 329,000 people. By 2000, it had fallen to 273,546, nearly 170,000 fewer than the 1930 peak. Newark lost every one of its movie theaters. At one point, only a single supermarket remained in the entire city. The tax base hollowed out so completely that the city became dependent on state aid to fund basic services. Kenneth Gibson, elected in 1970 as the city's first black mayor, described Newark as the most decayed and financially crippled city in the nation. Whether that was literally true is debatable, but the fact that a sitting mayor could say it and not be accused of exaggeration tells you something. The physical losses accumulated quietly. Prudential demolished those original George B. Post headquarters buildings in 1956, the gray limestone landmarks that had defined the company's identity for 6 decades, and replaced them with a 24-story modernist box of imperial Danby marble. It was a choice made in the language of progress, but what it actually said was that the past was an obstacle. The old Newark Athletic Club, a 10-story classicized building from 1922 that had been converted to the Military Park Hotel, was imploded in May of 1993 to clear land for the New Jersey Performing Arts Center. Before a crowd of 1,000 watching from the 22nd floor of One Newark Center, 85 pounds of explosives brought down a building that had once contained a grand ballroom, a swimming pool, a bowling alley, and 350 sleeping rooms. The wonderful entrance door, with its Corinthian columns, was salvaged and reconstructed on the lawn of the Performing Arts Center. The frieze showing men playing lacrosse, hockey, football, and baseball, nobody knows what happened to it. Bamberger's downtown location, that 1.2 million square foot cathedral of retail, contracted floor by floor through the 1970s and 1980s. Macy's had bought the company back in 1929, but had wisely kept the Bamberger's name for decades. The brand was worth more in New Jersey than Macy's was. It was still Bamberger's when the Christmas windows went up every year, mechanical dolls acting out "The Night Before Christmas" in the display cases. One half of the poem visible on Market Street, the other half around the corner on Halsey, with music wafting from speakers overhead. Children stood for hours, faces pressed to the glass. These aren't historical generalizations. People who lived through those years describe the windows with a precision that borders on reverence, the specific dolls, the specific music, the specific smell of popcorn in the lobby. But by the 1970s, the crowds had thinned irreversibly. Evening hours ended in 1979. In 1986, Macy's finally killed the Bamberger's name. The Newark store limped on as a one-floor discount outlet and closed for good in 1992, ending a century of commerce on that corner. The building survives as 165 Halsey Street, a telecommunications and data center. Amazon Web Services occupies space in what was once New Jersey's greatest department store. The 30-foot freight elevators that used to lower fully loaded delivery trucks to the basement sorting rooms are still there, the only physical evidence of what the building used to be. Hans closed its flagship in 1987. The building sat empty for years before being redeveloped in 2017 as a mixed-use complex with apartments, art spaces, and a Whole Foods. If you go inside, the atrium has been preserved, and you can see the bones of Goldwyn Starrett's 1901 design. But the 1,200 employees are gone, and the families and carriages are gone, and the sense that this was the center of something is gone. The Ballantine Brewery closed in 1972. Its last day of operation was March 31st, ending over a century of brewing on the banks of the Passaic. The Kruger Brewery had closed in 1961, squeezed out by the national consolidation that put Anheuser-Busch and Miller on top and pushed regional brewers to the wall. The Feigenspan Brewery was long gone. One by one, 35 breweries reduced to zero. The mansions on High Street survived in various states of repair and disrepair. The Kruger Mansion sat abandoned for decades until a developer invested $10 million to restore it around 2021. The Ballantine House was preserved by the Newark Museum. The Feigenspan Mansion became a community agency office. The Kastner Mansion, another beer baron's monument, caught fire twice and was demolished. Newark Penn Station still stands, and the Art Deco chandeliers still hang, and the travertine walls still glow in the afternoon light. $190 million in state money has gone into its restoration in recent years. The Robert Treat Hotel still operates across from Military Park, now a Best Western, its Crystal Room Ballroom still hosting events. The Prudential Center Arena opened in 2007 on the site of the old Central Railroad of New Jersey's Broad Street Station, which had closed in 1967. The same year as the riots, a coincidence that is not entirely a coincidence. The New Jersey Performing Arts Center opened in 1997 on the land where the Military Park Hotel had been imploded, and it draws over 400,000 visitors a year. Prudential Financial, which never left, employs more than 5,000 people downtown and has invested over $1 billion in the city in the last decade. The population has ticked upward since its nadir, reaching about 311,000 by 2020. New residential towers are going up. The Hans building has a Whole Foods. Military Park has been renovated. A person standing at Four Corners today might reasonably describe what they see as a renaissance, and they wouldn't be wrong exactly. But it is a renaissance built on the rubble of something that was, in its way, irreplaceable. Broad Street runs north from the old Four Corners, past the spot where Seth Boyden's statue stands in Washington Park, past the addresses where the great department stores operated, past the facades of theaters whose interiors have been dark for more than 50 years. If you look up, you can still read the carved stonework on the National Newark building and see the ghost of the mausoleum at Halicarnassus in its crown, 465 feet above a sidewalk where almost no one stops to look. The building has been renovated. The murals in the mezzanine depicting the growth of commerce in Newark are still there. Broad Street runs on, past the Prudential Tower, past the Cathedral Basilica of the Sacred Heart, a French Gothic structure with 232-foot twin towers whose construction took over 50 years, from 1898 to 1954, spanning 2 world wars and a depression, without anyone deciding to stop building it. It runs past Branch Brook Park, where 5,000 cherry trees bloom every spring in a city that most Americans, if they think of it at all, associate with highway exits and airport approaches. Broad Street was the spine. It held the banks, the theaters, the department stores, the hotels, the churches, the insurance towers, the railroad stations, the mansions. Everything Newark built, it built along Broad Street or within a few blocks of it. It is still there. The street is still there.